critics of the oil sands say they're ruining the environment, they have an enormous carbon footprint, they're dirty, costly and unsustainable over the long term. But a new research paper from the Montreal Economic Institute says there are promising technologies that could limit this environmental damage as well as cut production costs. Joining us today, Pierre Desrochers. He's an associate researcher at the Montreal Economic Institute and co-author of this paper, which is called Innovation and the Greening of Alberta's Oil Sands. Thanks very much indeed for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
The report makes fascinating reading. People can get it from your website. I mean, you argue that petroleum's been a pretty darn good fuel over the decades. And you even imply that rising human living standards have been linked to petroleum use. But hasn't it got more to do with clean water and universal education?
Well, all these things were made possible ultimately by greater energy use. Some of it came from coal, some of it came from natural gas, but a significant amount of it came from petroleum. And that is my problem with current discussion of the oil sands. I mean, people have no sense of history, no sense of trade-offs. And so the paper discusses first how historically petroleum not only improved living standards, I think everybody will agree on that, but how they also improved the state of our environment. I mean, a lot of people forget that the first significant petroleum product was kerosene, which essentially saved the whales in the 19th century. I mean, there would have been nothing left for Greenpeace to save in the 1960s and 70s if it had not been for the oil industry a century before. And then the first cars were polluting, and yes, they were not much to talk about compared to what we have today. But compared to urban horses, which were a terrible public health problem, they were a significant advance. And in more recent decades, among other things, petroleum has made possible a drastic increase in agricultural yields, and we're now able to move a lot more food over much longer distances than in the past. And as a result, by concentrating food production in the best locations and using a lot of fossil fuels to make them more those productions, to increase the yields of those production, a lot of marginal agricultural land has been abandoned the world over. And every economy that is at the level of development of Chile and above is seeing a significant increase of its forest covers. And somehow these points, which can be traced to a large part to petroleum, are completely missing from current environmental discussions.
Fascinating stuff. And, you know, you do note in your report that dead horses and horse poo was a major health problem. And, you know, a century ago,
well, think of that. I mean, horses had to go somewhere, and I'm taping this from old Montreal. I mean, I can go outside, and if I could take a few pictures, seeing a horse doing his thing is quite a sight to behold. But think about the thousands of horses in a confined space and how bad things were in the past. So, again, the first cars were problematic compared to the technologies we have today, but they created lesser problems than those that existed before. And the oil sands, in a way, are but the latest act in a play that has been going on for a century and a half. And what the history of the industry tells us is that you can actually have your cake and eat it too. You can increase production while becoming more efficient and reducing your environmental impact in the process. So again, nobody denies that there are still problems with the oil sands, but things have been getting better, and there's no reason to believe that they cannot get even better if we don't turn our back on technological innovation.
Well, let me just jump in there, sorry, because obviously the industry is moving to this in situ oil sands, using vast amounts of natural gas, arguably a clean fuel to produce a dirty fuel. But we've been talking to Simon Dyer of the Pembina Institute. They're critical observers of the oil sands. They say that if you look at the actual greenhouse gas emissions from this in situ oil sands production, it's 23% higher than the mining that we're so familiar with the tailings ponds and stuff. So it looks like global warming is being worsened by this move to in situ oil sands development.
Well, but there are two things. First of all, we need synthetic crude oil more than we need natural gas, which is why we use natural gas to produce synthetic crude to begin with. And then you have to remember, well, were the days of, our low carbon footprint so great? And actually they were miserable. And again, this is completely missing from the discussion. I mean, before fossil fuels came along, people were depending entirely on local food. And 2 bad harvests in a row and you would have a famine. And it was long-distance transportation, which today is completely dominated by petroleum products, that actually put an end to famine and significantly increased life expectancy by moving the surplus of regions that had good years to regions that had bad years, and making food generally much more available and much cheaper. So again, keep those trade-offs in mind when you think about greenhouse gas emissions. We've been dealing with a warming period that has lasted over a century now, and again, our standards of living have improved improved drastically. We're much more food secure. We're much more food secure than we used to be. But somehow these notions are completely lost in the public debate, which is one of the reasons why my co-author and I, Hiroko Shimizu, wrote the paper in the first place.
Pierre, I'm happy to hear that technology innovation is helping the oil sand situation and that we're reducing our greenhouse gas emissions. And I'm also happy that, we're not riding horses anymore to get to work. We're riding them for leisure, and that's great. But one of the things I think may be a little bit misunderstood is that when we talk about reducing greenhouse gas emissions by the barrel of oil
per unit, per barrel,
per unit, yes. Yeah, it can be misleading because obviously over the last 20 years, our total absolute production has increased dramatically. So greenhouse gas emissions have
increased dramatic means that the oil sands are responsible for something like 0.1% of world greenhouse gas emissions. I mean, who is ramping up its production of fossil fuel right now? And it's really China. I mean, you know how many coal-fired plants they're building. So again, you need to put things in a broader context.
I agree.
And it's 0.1%, yes.
I know. I think it's fair enough that you point that out, that the greenhouse gas emissions are in the grand scale so small for the world out of the oil sands. But I think it's also just we have to be careful we don't mislead people and they start to pick on that, because I, for one, think that there's lots of innovation that can come out and we can increase or lower our greenhouse gas emissions per barrel going forward.
Yeah, but again, the point of the paper is not to deny that, but simply to point out the trade-offs. And what we argue is that we sincerely believe that the world is a better place with a little bit more greenhouse gas emissions, but much more resiliency built in the system that is ultimately based on petroleum products.
You say it's a myth that petroleum is getting more expensive and dirtier to produce, but I mean, that's hard to buy, isn't it? We know the Pembina Institute point out that the new reserves in Angola, Nigeria, Gulf of Mexico, Brazil, this fantastically deep water drilling, it's highly expensive.
Well, it depends compared to what. I mean, of course, they're more difficult to reach, but the problem with people who say that is that they only look at the geology of the deposits. They don't look at the technology that we have available. And actually, accessing these resources today is not much more costly than accessing what we would consider good deposits today with 1900 technologies. So you must never forget the technology that is at your disposal versus the geological formation that you're looking at. And in the long run, production costs are actually not all that different. We're much better at locating the oil and extracting it from the ground than we were a century ago. So overall, the costs are not so much greater.
It's interesting. I mean, human ingenuity, you're right, has over a century or more brought down the cost of commodities. Yeah. A lot of food for thought there. I think we have to leave it there, but I know we're going to get an awful lot of reaction to this interview, and your report is fascinating, and people can get it from the Montreal
Economic Institute website.
Yes. Thanks very much, Pierre Desrochers. He's a co-author of that report.